Macbeth. Macbeth is Shakespeare's shortest tragedy and tells the story of a brave Scottish general named Macbeth who receives a prophecy from a trio of witches that one day he will become King of Scotland. Now, the story of Macbeth and the character of Macbeth is based on the real Macbeth, a man who actually lived. His name was Macbeth Mac Finlaysh, and he was born in round about 1005 AD. So if we look at a timeline of his life and we compare it to the fictional Macbeth, in August 1040, the real Macbeth killed the ruling king of Scotland, Duncan I, in battle. Macbeth then went on to become king. He married Kenneth III's granddaughter, and this strengthened his claim to the throne. In 1045, he defeated and killed Duncan I's father in battle, and Macbeth had a 14-year reign over Scotland. In 1050, he travelled to Rome for the papal jubilee, and he was considered a brave leader, and he made many successful forays to the border into England. In 1054, he was challenged by a man named Siward, who was attempting to return Duncan's son Malcolm to the throne. And in August 1057, Macbeth was killed in battle. So now we need to look at the history behind Macbeth and the history behind the play, and this is England and Scotland's political and religious history. So we're going to take it all the way back to England's Tudor legacy, and we're going to start with King Henry VIII. Now, King Henry VIII is very famous for having 6 wives, and we're going to quickly look at all 6 of them. That picture over there is the most famous portrait of Henry VIII. His first wife was Catherine of Aragon. Now, King Henry was not the first king. His brother was actually first in line for the throne, and his brother had married this woman named Catherine of Aragon, but he had died, and so King Henry was forced to marry Catherine. And he then wanted to divorce her, and at that time, England was Catholic, and in Catholicism, you could not divorce your wife. And so he changed the religion of England to Protestantism in order to divorce her. They had only one child together, Mary I. Now, he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon because he'd met a woman named Anne Boleyn, and so she was his second wife after he divorced Catherine. But after a little while of marriage, she was executed on charges of adultery, incest, and witchcraft. They also only had one child, Elizabeth I. Now, after Anne Boleyn, Henry married a woman named Jane Seymour. She was his third and considered his favorite wife, but she died due to birth complications. They also only had one child, Edward. Now, after Jane Seymour died, King Henry's advisors thought that it would be good for him to marry someone who would be good for political game, and so they set up a marriage between him and Anne of Cleves, and she was his 4th wife. Now, they met only a few days before the wedding, and Henry then decided he did not want to marry her because of her looks. He had been receiving paintings of her, and he said that the paintings of her did not depict what she actually looked like. And they divorced 6 months later, and she lived as the king's sister until her death, so she was very well looked after. After that, he married Catherine Howard. She was the 5th wife, and she was only 19 years old when she married a 49-year-old Henry. She was called his Rose Without a Thorn, but eventually, like all the other wives, she was executed on charges of adultery and treason. He then finally married a woman named Catherine Parr, and she was known as the Peacemaker, and she actually outlived him. If you look at that photo, there was a series made called The Tudors, and Jonathan Rhys-Meyers played King Henry, and there Natalie Dormer played Anne Boleyn. Now we need to look at the Tudor legacy after Henry died. So Henry's son, Edward VI, who was his son with Jane Seymour, was crowned at the age of 9, was crowned King of England and Ireland. He was raised a Protestant and so kept the religion as Protestant, but he died of tuberculosis at the age of 16. After him, his half-sister Mary I, who was Catherine of Aragon's daughter, ascended to the throne. She was 37 when she was crowned, and she was crowned Queen of England and Ireland. She was known as Bloody Mary because she was a Catholic who violently persecuted the Protestants, and she died of a reproductive system disease. After her, Elizabeth I, who was Anne Boleyn's daughter, was crowned. She was crowned at the age of 25 and was crowned as the Queen of England and Ireland, and she was a Protestant. She was known as the Virgin Queen because she avoided marriage until her death and then, in avoiding marriage, left no heir for the throne. She reigned for 45 years, and she died at the age of 70 because of sepsis, and she was the last of the Tudor line. So literature and culture flourished during her reign. She was a big advocate of the arts, and this was really when Shakespeare's career was taking off, and she appointed her successor, James V of Scotland, or James I of England. And so after her now came James, who was originally James V of Scotland, but when he ascended to the throne, he became James I of England. He was crowned at the age of 37, and he started what was known as the Stuart dynasty. Now, he had great political ambition. He wanted to consolidate England and Scotland and make one Great Britain. In 1611, he commissioned the English translation of the Bible, and that is why we have the King James Bible. He believed in the divine and supreme right of kings, that God had placed kings on the throne. And so regicide, which is the murder of a king or the assassination of a king, is a cardinal sin, is a sin that cannot be forgiven by God. And now he feared being assassinated, and he was almost assassinated in the 1605 gunpowder plot. And he was also a strong believer in witchcraft, and he presided over persecution of witches, witch hunts, and the persecution of witches in Scotland specifically. So the gunpowder plot of 1605 was organized by Robert Catesby, and it was to end the persecution of Roman Catholics by the English government. Now, it was a failed attempt in that they did not manage to blow up James I and the English Parliament. And that man in the picture, there's a man named Guy Fawkes, and he was arrested while guarding these explosives. And so November 5th is known as Guy Fawkes Day, and it is to commemorate this gunpowder plot. There is a movie called V for Vendetta where they use the gunpowder plot and Guy Fawkes to drive the plot of the film. And in there is this very famous saying that they say, remember, remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. And that is the Guy Fawkes mask that they wear. So now we need to look at Shakespeare and James I. Now, Macbeth is considered a bit of a tribute to James I. And this is why, because in Macbeth, it talks about the divine right of kings and that disturbing the way of things has consequences. And we see this when Macbeth kills Duncan and everything is just turned topsy-turvy. And so his murdering of Duncan sets the play on a dark path and it seals Macbeth's fate. And this really is to go to show that regicide is not a good thing. Now, if we look at James's lineage gave him a very strong claim to the English throne and really proved that he should be there. And that is why the character of Banquo, who is a Scottish noble that James claims to have descended from, reinforces this lineage. And that's why it's a bit of a tribute to James when we have the character of Banquo in Macbeth. Now, if we look at the Scottish history, Duncan was actually not a good thing, a good king in the real Scottish history. And Macbeth, the real Macbeth, actually brought stability to Scotland. But then obviously Shakespeare could now not enforce this idea that regicide is a good thing. And so he changed the story in that Duncan is murdered and Macbeth's kingship brings absolute turmoil to Scotland. And also because James was a descendant of Duncan, part of his lineage, and so Shakespeare had to make adjustments to the history there. Now, witchcraft. As I said earlier, James was quite interested in witchcraft and superstition, and so the three witches and the prophecies within this play could be Shakespeare's way of trying to win the approval of James. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Act 5, Scene 5.